We're told that we're not allowed to test Hashem. The question is, what is considered testing Hashem? And how is that different to just transgressing or rebelling? We're going to see in this week's parasha that Hashem says the Jewish people tested me 10 times. And based on how Rashi explains what that really means, give us a tremendous lesson about how careful we have to be to acknowledge Hashem's blessings and certainly His miracles in our lives. Fun pasuk, on the pasuk Vaynassos Izeh Pe'amim, where Hashem says to Moshe that the Jewish people tested me 10 times, then Rab Chazal, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, teaches us Asoren, Nisyonis, Nisu, Avosenu, Es HaKadosh Baruch Hu B'Midbar, that our forefathers tested Hashem 10 times in the desert. The question is, what were these 10 times? We're going to see that there are 3 classical opinions, and then Rashi's take, which raises a few questions initially, and then gives us a tremendous insight into what it means to test Hashem. So, wegen die Asoren, Nisyonis, Gefint, Men Kama Deos, there are a number of opinions about what the 10 are. Umehem, we're going to look at 3 of them, starting first, Aleph in Maseches Erchin. The Gemara Erchin says as follows. We're going to do the list and then how the Gemara explains them. Shnaim Bayom, they tested Hashem twice at the Yam Suf. Shnaim Bamoim, twice with regards to water. Shnaim Bamon, twice with regards to the Mon. Shnaim Bislav, twice with regards to the quail. Achas Ba'egel, once at the Egel Hazav. Achas B'midbar Paran, and once in Paran. What are they? The Gemara is the Nachmefor. The Gemara explains. Shlayim Bayom, they tested Hashem twice at the sea, once on the way to Yamsuf and once when they left the Yamsuf. Achas B'yirid, on their way to the Yamsuf, they said, Hami Bli Ein Kvarim B'Mitzrayim. What are there? No graves in Egypt that you had to take us to die in the desert. Achas Ba'aliyah, and they tested Hashem again after they exited from the miraculous splitting of the sea, and they said, Kashem Sh'onu Oilu Mitzad Zeh, Kach Mitzrayim Oilu Mitzad Acher. We may have come out safe on one side of the sea, but how do we know that the Egyptians did not emerge safely on the other side of the sea? Shnayim B'moyim, they tested Hashem twice with water. That's B'morah, when they complained about the bitter waters of Morah, and then not long after that, B'Refidim, when they complained that there was no water to drink in the desert. That's just before the attack of Amalek. Shnayim B'mon, they tested Hashem twice with the mon because Hashem said, Al Teitzu, don't go out on Shabbos to look for mon, Vayetzu, and there were people who did. But Al Teisira, and he said, don't keep any mon for tomorrow because you'll get exactly the right amount that you need every single day. Vayosira, and there were people who kept the mon for the next day. Shnayim B'slav, the 2 occasions where they tested Hashem that they wanted meat and they got the slav, is Slav Rishon, the Pashas B'Shalach, firstly in Pashas B'Shalach, Slav Sheni, the Pashas Ba'Lo, and a different occasion where they complained about meat and they got meat in Pashas Ba'Lo. Then there's Egel, which is obviously Egel Azav, and Midbar Paran is the Meraglim. So that's the list according to the Gemara Erchin. Beis in Avos Rabbi Nosson state, Avos Rabbi Nosson has a different list. As the Asoni Sene Zainen, the 10 times they tested Hashem were as follows: Cheto Ego, which you're going to see everybody agrees, the golden calf. Vayitzma Sham Ha'om Lamayim B'Refidim, once when they complained about the water, which was in Refidim, that they had nothing to drink. Himra al Yamsuf, they once tested Hashem when they rebelled at Yamsuf. Meraglim, the spies, which is across the board. Tafru alamon, later on when they complained about the repetitive nature of the mon, and the fact that it's they thought they were going to die because it never produced any waste. Machlakusa shel Korach, the fact that they had the debate, the fight, the rebellion of Korach. Slav, generally. On the Dainu Senes v'Savera, Uvamasa v'Kibras HaTaiva, and then 3 others which are alluded to in the rebuke of Moshe, which is Tavera is Misoinanim, where they complained against Hashem in Parshas Ba'aloischa, and Hashem killed a whole lot of people through fire. But Masa v'Lekitas Hamon, when it came to gathering them on, and Kibras HaTaiva, which is Slav Sheni in Parshas Ba'aloischa, the second time that they had the Slav. So in other words, Loit Ded, they ever and what the obviously Rabbi Nosson includes, which the Gemara does not, is Chet Misoinanim, where the people complained generically about their stay in the desert. Ma'aseh Korach, which should be quite an obvious one. Tafel Alamon, where they complain about the mon. And instead, the obviously Rabbi Nosson leaves out the complaint about bitter waters, which the Gemara had quoted, and Ein Nisayin Bayom and Ein Nisayin Bamon, and leaves out one of the times that they, according to the Gemara, tested Hashem at the sea, and one of the times that they tested Hashem with the mon. Third opinion, the Rambam Bepirush HaMishnayis Sheloi, Rechen the Asorin Nisyonis, the Rambam's list in his Pirush HaMishnayis goes as follows: Yamsuf, one occasion that they tested Hashem at the sea; Morah, that they tested Hashem with the bitter waters; Bakosas Hamon B'Midbar Sin, very interesting, that they requested mon, or at least they requested food, which ended up being the mon. Al Toisiru, the fact that they tested Hashem when he said, don't keep mon until tomorrow, and they did. Al Teitzabi Shabbos, don't go looking for mon on Shabbos, and they looked for mon. Maim B'Refidim, the fact that they complained of a lack of water in Refidim. Ma'aseh Ha'egel, making the egel. Tav'era Misoinanim, the fact that they complained generically in Parshas Ba'aloischa and they were burnt up. Kibras HaTaiva Slav, the time where the people were buried because they overate. They, as Hashem said, it's going to come out of their noses the amount of slav and meat that they wanted. Uchet HaMeraglim, and the spies. So Leute, der kommt zu. So what's the Rambam adding? If we're comparing him to the Gemara, the Chet HaMisoinim is including the time where the Jews complained in Parashas Ba'al Yisra. As well as the fact that the Jews requested that they needed food and therefore they got them on. And so according to the Rambam, we leave out one of the times that they tested Hashem at the sea and one of the times that they tested Hashem with the slav. So those are the three opinions. Let's have a look at Rashi, who doesn't really seem to align with, he aligns with the Gemara in Erchin, and we have to understand why, according to Pshat, that's the best list to follow. So Rashi befirush al Torah from pasuk zeh pe'omim is meforish. Rashi takes those words where it says these 10 times and he explains them to me as follows: Shnayim bayom, twice at the sea; Shnayim bamon, twice with regards to the mon; Shnayim beslav v'chulei, twice with the slav, and then he says etc. Kedisim Maseches Erchin, and he refers us to the Gemara Erchin v'dideya in Erchin. Okay, so no, let's understand why Rashi doesn't go with the opinion of Avos Rabbi Nosson and with the opinion of the Rambam. So the easiest one to explain is why Rashi would not concur with the list of Avos Rabbi Nosson, because remember, Rashi is Pshat, and Avos Rabbi Nosson does not actually work according to simple Pshat. So that does, so Rashi b'derech hapshat ken nitonim the idea from Avos Rabbi Nosson is move, and it's self-understood why Rashi would not follow the view of Avos Rabbi Nosson. Because both the uprising of Korach and when the Jews would complain about the Mon are things that happened later on in the story, after the Meraglim had already occurred. And according to Pshat, Meraglim is the 10th of the times that they tested the Jewish people, that they tested Hashem. How do we know that? Because the time where Hashem said, they tested me 10 times, is by the Meraglim, implying that all 10 occasions had to have happened before the Meraglim. And so Korach and Tafel Alamon is after the Meraglim, does not belong on the list according to Pshat. So we get why Rashi does not follow the list of Avos Rabbi Nosson. What we do have to understand is why then does Rashi go with the list that is in the Gemara Erchin? Why does he not concur with the list of the Rambam? Now, one of the things that the Rambam says, it will be clear why Rashi doesn't agree with, and yet one of the things that the Rambam says, actually it seems very strange that Rashi does not have it on his list. So when the Rambam suggested that one of the times that the Jews tested Hashem was when they requested Mon, it's pretty clear why Rashi would not put that on his list, because Rashi, taking the simplest understanding of the Psukim, says that to ask for bread is appropriate. And not only is it appropriate, the Eibishter recognized that it was an appropriate request, and therefore he gave them on with love. And we can understand why instead of saying that they were testing Hashem by asking for bread, he would say that the 2 occasions where they tested Hashem by asking for meat were both inappropriate, because meat is not something that you have to have, it's not a staple food, and therefore it is considered a test of Hashem. That makes sense. What doesn't make sense is the fact that they complained against Hashem, and Hashem sent this fire to consume those who complained against him, which is before the Meraglim. But that is something which you don't have to read into. It's said clearly in the Chumash. Why is it not on the list of times that they tested Hashem? And conversely, based on the thought that they tested Hashem when they emerged from the sea and said, how do we know the Egyptians haven't survived? That's not something you can actually see in the words in the Pasuk. In fact, to the contrary, from Pirshas and Parshas B'Shalach, when you read Rashi's comments at that point, where he says, where he says that the Eibishter specifically made sure that all of the bounty of the Egyptians would wash up on the shore, so that the Jews should not believe possibly the Egyptians had escaped somewhere out of sight. Is muchach as Rashi nemton. That implies that Rashi believes that seems to imply that they didn't actually test Hashem, saying, how do we know the Egyptians haven't escaped? Seeing as Rashi always looks to explain the simplest understanding of the Psukim, he dafka should have included Misonim, which is stated clearly in the Torah, and he should not have included a reference to the possibility that they tested Hashem a second time when they came out of the Yam Suf, which does not seem to fit with the Pshat. And that would be more aligned with the list that the Rambam makes, which also is a list based on things stated clearly in the Psukim, and would make more sense for Rashi to speak the language of the Rambam than to quote the list in the Gemara Erchin. And one last point about that, if Rashi is going to count that there were 2 times they tested Hashem on the way into and the way out of the Yam Suf, that would seem to imply, well, you can't pretend that the Torah did not say they tested Hashem by complaining in Parshas Ba'aloscha before the Meraglim. So that has to be part of the equation. That implies that by the time they got to the Meraglim, there's actually 11, not 10 times that they tested Hashem. So how's Rashi going to explain that? Now, before we get to unpack Rashi, a few other things that we have to consider. In obviously Rabbi Nosson verbindet kama v'chama von der Asarnis mit dem Pasuk. What obviously Rabbi Nosson does is links many of the things that are on the list of the 10 times that the Jews tested Hashem with Moshe's rebuke later in Parashas Devarim. Now, when we look at how Rashi deals with those words of the rebuke, it sounds like Rashi is saying something similar to the obviously Rabbi Nosson, which is then going to raise the question: so which one is it? Does Rashi believe that the list from Devarim is in fact the times that they tested Hashem, or is it this list over here that are the times that they tested Hashem, and why would these be different? So, what's the pasuk? The pasuk is Eila Dvarim Asher Dibur Moshe Goyim in the beginning of Parshas Devarim. It says these are the words of rebuke that Moshe gave to the Jewish people. Where? Bamidbar, Ba'arava, Goyim Evedizav, a whole lot of locations that are listed. And the obviously Rabbi Nosson says that Azay ver Nirmas in Dinem and was dot oisgerechen im pasuk. The names of those locations listed in that pasuk are actually hints at the various misbehaviors of the Jewish people. Derech zeh von einer Mandome in Sifri, as the alle Asoren Yisraelis welche werden ausgerechnet in Maseches Erchin Beis v'Yom Chulei seine Merumas in dem Pasuk Hanal. Likewise, there's an opinion in the Sifri that says whatever are the 10 times they tested Hashem listed in the Gemara Erchin are all reflected in that Pasuk Eile Hadvarim. Now, seeing as Rashi follows the same list of 10 tests that the Gemara Erchin does, you would anticipate that Rashi would see that in the words of Eile Hadvarim as well, like this opinion in the Sifri. Rashi seems to say that. Rashi tells us Eila Advarim is not just simple words that Moshe spoke to the Jewish people before he passed away, but it was specifically words of rebuke. And Rashi is the one who tells us that the list of locations that are used at the beginning of Parshas Devarim are in fact locations where they angered Hashem. And then Rashi goes through a list that this location hints at this particular misbehavior. When it says that they were in the desert, that tells us that's when they angered Hashem in the desert by saying it's better if we would have died in Egypt and not have to come over here. Arava means Arava is a reminder of the fact that they served the idol of Baal Peor in that region. Mayel Suf, when it tells us that they were across from or next to the Yam Suf, that's alluding to the fact that they rebelled against Hashem at the Yam Suf. Bain, pardon of Bain, Teifel, Velov on those 3 locations are either locations or allude to events that happened. Shetov, Lalamon, Shu, Lavan, so Lavan, white is a reminder of the fact that they complained about the mon, which was white in color. Bemidbar, Paran Alideh, Hameraglim, the Paran desert is where they had the Meraglim. Chatzeros is a representation of the rebellion of Korach. Vedizahav is not a place so much as a reference to the gold from which they made Ha'egel. So you might recognize that there are things on that list which are not on the list of the 10 tests according to Rashi. So it's pretty clear now that Rashi's understanding of the pasuk Eile Hadvarim is that it lists occasions where they angered Hashem, which to us sounds like they tested Hashem, yet it's not the same list of things that Rashi says are the 10 tests. Which Rashi quotes in our parasha. So we need to understand what's going on over here. Why doesn't Rashi just go with that opinion in the Sifri, or according to the obvious Rabbi Nosson, which is as the Divrei Teichach von Moshe Rabbeinu sein bescheiches zu dieselbe Chatoim, was say hat Eibischer Mechiach gewend die Eden gesagt die gewein nasse is peomim. Why doesn't he just simply say the same things that are recorded as part of Moshe's rebuke in Parashas Devarim are the same 10 tests of Hashem that Hashem complains, so to speak, about in our parasha? Why does Rashi have what appears to be 2 different lists? And before we can answer all of our questions about Rashi, we're just going to pay attention to some of the nuances in Rashi's language as well. In Lashon Rashi b'Parshas and Gufo is move on 2 key areas that don't seem to make sense in the wording that Rashi uses. Number 1, Aleph. Something really doesn't make sense over here. Rashi does not list all 10 of the tests, he just lists a few and then he says, etc. Now, and he effectively says, if you want to know more detail, because the detail is not necessarily relevant to the understanding of the simple meaning of the pasuk, which is why Rashi doesn't list it. So, as Rashi says, go look in Maseches Serchin if you want to know the rest of the list. So, it would appear that Rashi's perspective is, you don't have to know all of the details, but I'll refer to you to where you can find it. But in order to understand the pshat, you just have to know that this is the source of the list. So if that's what Rashi is doing, so don't you think it would make a lot more sense, instead of giving us the majority, there are 10 items on the list. Rashi quotes 6 of the items and then it says etc. and look further in Maseches Serchin. Don't you think it would have made more sense to say list 2 of them and then say etc. and go look in Erchin for the rest? Second of all, Beis, the Loshin in Maseches Serchin is, you're going to notice that Rashi skips one of the things that is on the list in Erchin. There it says, Shnaim Bayom, there were 2 times they tested Hashem at the sea. Shnaim Bamoyim, twice with water. Shnaim Bamon, twice with the food. Shnaim Beslav, twice with the meat. Rashi skips the part about the 2 times they tested Hashem with regards to water. And he leaves that into the etc. Where the etc. that he puts after the 2 occasions where they tested Hashem with a slav. So that's strange. You're quoting the Gemara Erchin. You're telling us to look in Erchin, but then you're skipping something that's on the list in Erchin and leaving it as an etc. That's such a strange way to list things. And dit mir is noch größer. The truth is, it's an even bigger question than we imagine, because the einzige von die alle 10, was der Torah sagt beferisch, as Eden haben damit Manasseh given the Meibishten, the only time where you hear the Torah using language that the Jews tested Hashem is from the Shnaim Bamoyim, is with regards to water. Water being what Rashi left off the list, right? Then Nisoim Berefidim, when they tested Hashem in Refidim to say we have nothing to drink. So Rashi's explaining the word Vayinasu, what it means to test Hashem, how many times they tested Hashem, where those occasions are, and the one time out of the 10 where it actually relates their behavior to testing Hashem, doesn't say it. And he leaves it up to the etc. Okay, so we'll propose an answer and then we'll see that it doesn't really work. It sounds like a great answer, but it really doesn't work. Maybe we could address at least these linguistic anomalies in Rashi by saying, so by Rashi giving us that etc. and the hyperlink to the Gemara in Erchin, he's not trying to draw our attention to what the other 4 that he hasn't listed are. Instead he's trying to tell us which 6 you might have gotten wrong, and so therefore I have to spell them out for you. So instead of saying there's more information to look at, which is valid, he really wants to just draw our attention to things we might have misunderstood. And under a verta. Think about it. He has a child who's learning the pasuk. Pasuk says, Hashem says, you tested me 10 times. The first thing that's going to cross the child's mind is, I wonder when those 10 times are. He's going to page back through the Chumash and find occasions that he believes that the Jewish people tested Hashem. And particularly ones that are glaring in the woods. Therefore, Rashi is going to say, now you're doing your homework and you're reviewing the Torah to identify the times that the Jewish people appear to test Hashem. Let's ensure that you don't get that information wrong. And that would explain why Rashi doesn't have to say there are 2 occasions with regards to water where they tested Hashem, because the Torah uses the word Vayinasu, so we know that was a time that they tested Hashem. And likewise, Rashi doesn't have to draw our attention to the Egel Azov or to the Meraglim, which are very obvious tests of their belief in Hashem. Rashi does have to address what happened at the sea. Because there the Torah only specifically tells us one way that they tested Hashem, which is, are there no graves and you had to take us to die in the desert. So Rashi has to tell us, guess what? There's actually a second way that they tested Hashem at the sea, and you've got to look to understand what it is. So have a look in the Gemara and it will tell you what happened. Likewise, with regards to the mon. You might have thought, okay, mon is one of the occasions where they tested Hashem. Maybe, like the Rambam says, asking for mon, asking for bread was part of the test. It does say that they complained, so that sounds like a test. So therefore Rashi has to clarify that as far as he is concerned, based on the Gemara in Erchin, there are only two tests with the mon about keeping leftovers and looking for mon on Shabbos. Likewise, you could misunderstand what the nature of their complaint or their testing of Hashem was with regards to the slav, because there are the commentators who say as the Sipurim begging them slav in Parshas B'Shalach and Parshas Ba'aloischa, that the two occasions that the Torah speaks about them complaining about meat and then getting the slav in return, were not on two different occasions. They're only recorded twice in the Torah. Now, so therefore Rashi, following his approach, which is to clarify that we don't misunderstand what the times are that they tested Hashem, he tells us there were two different occasions where they complained about meat. Sounds like a beautiful explanation. I mean, Rashi is really caring for our potentially misguided understanding of the psukim. However, it's really quite a stretch to argue that this is what Rashi is trying to do, because so in the same way as you might feel unclear about whether requesting bread is appropriate or inappropriate, because going with Rashi's logic, which is bread is a staple food and therefore it's actually appropriate to ask for it, well then by the same logic, that when they arrive at Mora and the water is all bitter and they ask, what should we drink? Maybe that's not necessarily testing Hashem, seeing as water is as much, if not more, of a staple than bread. And likewise, you could say the fact that the Jews complained and therefore they were punished by Hashem, does that necessarily mean that they tested Hashem? In other words, what we're really starting to understand over here is we need to be able to distinguish between testing Hashem and sinning or rebelling or complaining, because apparently they're not all the same. And that is the key to understanding what's going on over here. The Pirush Rashi's commentary here, and where it gives us the list, is not in isolation, but it's a direct follow on what Rashi just explained immediately before this, which is, that word vayinasu, they tested me. Rashi says, kim mashmoy is to be understood literally. Why is that? So the commentators on Rashi, like the Gur Arya and others, say, it is possible to imagine vayinasu means they angered me, rather than they tested me. Therefore, Rashi wants to clarify that the Torah is not saying that the Jews angered Hashem 10 times. Unfortunately, they angered Hashem more than 10 times. But rather that they tested Hashem, which is a very unique kind of an attitude, 10 times. They tested to see if the Eibishter, so to speak, would come through on his promises or was able to do certain things. Once you get that information, it's natural why the Rashi does not follow the Rambam's list. That the Misonanim, albeit something which is mentioned clearly in the Torah, actually is not a test of Hashem. Weil the chet is al pipshuta shel mikle da'as Rashi negiven ken inen von vayinasu oisi. Yes, they were complaining, but if you understand the simple meaning of testing Hashem, complaining is not always equal to testing. Misonanim was definitely a time where they quote unquote angered Hashem, but it wasn't a time where they tested Hashem. Nor nalila he'ach lifresh me'achrei amokim, as Rashi says. What they were looking for is an excuse to desist from doing what Hashem wanted. That's different to testing Hashem. That's transgression or rebellion rather than testing. On the Rebbe, Nemton Rashi dem Pirush from Maseches Erchin, because Rashi is understanding vayinasu kemashmo'oi, times that they tested Hashem. Therefore, the best list for that is the list in the Gemara Erchin. Because what is in common with all the 10 items on that list is they were testing Hashem. And testing Hashem indicates that they were lacking in faith. That is the common denominator between all these 10. Not misbehavior, not rejection, not rebellion, not transgression, but specifically a lack of faith, and therefore you're testing your faith. Und das ist der Time von der ausgerechnete Protim in Pirish Rashi, und in Pirish Rashi b'Parshas Devarim, which would explain why Rashi has one list here when he's talking about the 10 tests, and a different list when he interprets what Moshe's rebuke of the Jewish people is. Because in unser Seder, our parasha is focused specifically on things which are testing Hashem, and Parshas Devarim, whereas Parshas Devarim is Moshe rebuking the people for transgressions. They are not identical to tests. Not every transgression is in the mode of a test of Hashem. Even if they are very important, generic, central sins that the Jewish people did, they're not necessarily testing. So, for example, the Chet B'Baal Peor, the Avodah Zarah Baal Peor, Himru b'Yamsuf, rebelling against Hashem at the Yamsuf. Tofel al Amon, complaining about the Amon. Which is when Hashem sent the snakes. Chet HaMeraglim, following the negative views of the Meraglim. These are all terrible rebellions and transgressions, but they're not testing faith. Now we need to better understand what testing faith really means. So let's try and understand this better. Yes, by and large, when we use the word vayinasu, it means to test. But this pasuk adds more information. They tested me, and they didn't listen to my voice. Which implies that they actually transgressed. Practically, they didn't do what Hashem said. For example, he said, don't keep mon until tomorrow, and they did. So when they do something contrary to what Hashem wants, don't you then anticipate that vayinasu means, like it might mean in other scenarios, that they angered me instead of just tested me? Okay, moving. And let's just clarify. It is possible to test Hashem without actually transgressing. Like you see, many of the items on the list are not necessarily a rejection of not listening to Hashem's voice. For example, saying, we can't drink this water, there's no instruction that Hashem said to drink the water. How is Rashi so convinced that Vayinasu is kamashmoi, even though it says that it means literally that they tested Hashem rather than that they rebelled or transgressed? The reason why Rashi has to explain Vayinasu over here to mean to test is not just because that's the common translation, but because that's the context. And the minyan daiten Rashi on durch matik sein die drei Zuge in Nisyonis from Maseches Erchin Kidele Kamon. You want to understand the context? Rashi will give you 3 pairs of examples of their testing Hashem, and that will help you to appreciate what testing means and why that is relevant over here. Before we can get to that, we have to understand in the parasha by looking at a few things in our parasha that raise questions. Number 1, Aleph. Our parasha Shelach. Nachdem wie der Eibishter hat gesagt zu Moshe Rabbeinu, the Eibishter tells Moshe after this horrific incident of the spies and the terrible dissolution of faith of the Jewish people, so the Eibishter says, let me wipe them out and, so to speak, start again with you. Moshe says, what are you talking about? The Mitzrayim are going to hear what's happening. And they're going to speak to the Canaanites and tell them, we heard that Hashem is so powerful, etc. And He can't bring them into your land. You're going to wipe out the whole people in one shot. And the nations amongst themselves are going to say, Hashem is incapable of bringing the Jews into the land. So this is such a strange interaction between Moshe and Hashem. How is it possible? That outside of that response, that the nations of the world are going to say something. Was there no other argument that Moshe could have found? Was there no other defense of the Jews that he could have used? To protect the whole Jewish nation, God forbid, from the worst? You're talking 600,000 adults between the ages of 20 and 60, which extrapolates out with the children and the youth and the elderly to like 3 million people. And the only way Moshe could think about confronting Hashem not to chas v'shalom is to say, what are the nations going to say? Number 2, Beis, Moshe hat gebeten dem Eibishten. We do see that Moshe petitions Hashem, Slach no lavino mazek chastecha, in your great kindness, forgive the people's sin. And as you've carried them through all of their difficulties till now, you'll carry them again. Und der Eibishter hat dem asking given. So the Eibishter said, you're right. Und gesagt, and he says, I'll forgive them as you have requested. Isn't it moving? That makes no sense now. If the Eibishter forgives them, why didn't it help? And they still didn't go into Eretz Yisrael. If they're forgiven, they should be forgiven. Why can't they go into Eretz Yisrael? Understanding this will give us a tremendous insight into what is going on over here and what the nature of a test is. Let's split two things over here. The Eibishter said that this generation cannot enter Israel, and he suggested chas v'sholem, that they might be wiped out. So why can't they go into Israel? It's not because the Eibishter was, so to speak, angry with him and decided to punish them. It's the natural consequence of where they were at and how they behaved. Because all of the factual report back information that the Meraglim brought, how powerful the indigenous nations were, was absolutely accurate. The only way that you could enter the land of Israel and hope to conquer it would be with absolute faith in Hashem's hand and His miracles. You couldn't consider the strength of the people. You had to believe that the Eibishter will empower you in a miraculous way to overcome them. So the only way to conquer this land was with absolute emunah. And Rashi quotes Kalev's words. Look how the Eibishter conducted things till now, miraculously. He split the sea, he gave us miraculous food to eat, he even produced meat for us. Therefore, we will certainly go up into Eretz Yisrael, says Rashi. Even if we had to go into the heavens, even if Moshe Rabbeinu had told us to build ladders that go into the heaven, we'll succeed in everything that Moshe Rabbeinu tells us. Everything in a supernatural way. That explains the language that the Eibishter used to Moshe. How long will they not believe in me? Considering all the great miracles I've done for them. Therefore, I'm going to respond in the harshest way. In other words, because Yidden have lost faith in the Eibishter's capacity to operate in a miraculous fashion. They have blocked themselves from being the recipients of those miracles. They now no longer have the capacity, that generation, to enter Israel in a miraculous way. And this is something which is not a surprise to us because the Torah said it outright in Pashas B'chukosav. If you take an attitude to me that things are happenstance and that it's not directed from on high, so I'm going to do the same to you. And therefore you cannot survive this, and the people chas v'shalom are going to die out in the desert. In other words, it makes perfect sense that they had lost their opportunity to have this miraculous entry into Israel. But then Moshe Rabbeinu says, okay, I get it. They can't go into Israel, but the nations are going to hear that you wiped out the whole people chas v'shalom here in the desert, and then they're going to say you were unable to bring them into the land. But says Moshe to the Eibishter, what's the whole reason that you're saying that the Jews have lost their miraculous abilities and their protection? It's because of lack of faith. So it makes no sense then. Chas v'shalom, you wipe out the whole nation over here. All that's going to do is create greater lack of faith. The nations of the world are going to lose faith in Hashem. They're going to say the Eibishter is not powerful enough to be able to take over our land. In other words, he understands the same reason that you're giving why the Jews can't go into the land and why they deserve to die is the same reason why it shouldn't happen immediately. Because it's going to precipitate more lack of faith. So to that, the Eibishter says, okay, I'll forgive them based on that. On Rashi is meforish. Rashi says clearly, what's because of that? The fact that you said that the nations of the world will lose faith, that's why I'm not going to kill everybody. So if the Eibishter forgives the Yidden, that removes the threat that they might all be wiped out in a flash. But the fact that they were forgiven, and therefore not immediately mowed down, chas v'shalom, that does not excuse them, it does not help them to get into Israel. Because the reason they can't go into Israel is not Hashem punishing them. No, that is a direct result of their lack of faith. When you lack faith, you don't have miracles. When you don't have miracles, you have to conquer the land in a natural way. Naturally, it's impossible to win. It's not possible for them to conquer Eretz Yisrael. That's why they're not going in. Now, with that insight, is moving that explains why, against the backdrop of this incident with the spies and their lack of faith, that's why Rashi has to interpret Vayinasu means literally they tested Hashem. Even though the next words in the pasuk may have misled us to believe that Vayinasu means they angered me, because they were not listening. But the entire thrust of this parasha, the theme of this parasha is the big issue at hand over here is weak faith of that generation. Which was the direct cause of them losing the opportunity to go into the land. With that information, that would explain why Rashi only quoted 6 out of the 10 from the lists of tests that the Gemara brings. Because these are the 6 that illustrate to us how weak their faith had become. Which would also explain why Moshe Rabbeinu could not cancel the block against going into Israel. So what's happening over here? What does a nisayon mean, and how is it expressed in these 6 examples? The Birindem, it says follows. In a Friedrich Pasuk state, there's an earlier Pasuk that says, how long will you in the future, says the Eibishter, not believe in my signs? Here it's a little different. Here we're talking in the context of Hashem telling them that they cannot get into the land of Israel. There, the Eibishter uses the expression, they saw all the signs and they tested me. It doesn't say and they didn't believe in me. What's the difference between not believing and testing? The fun is Rashi Medayik. Firstly, Rashi uses that as his source, as the chet for Vayinasu Oisi is in dem inyan harbe vi lo yaminu bistam. Rashi is implying over here, Vayinasu kamashmoi, they tested Hashem. Testing Hashem is far worse than feeling a lack of faith. Was der Fall ist, dass Asiba, als nachdem wie der Eibishter Shelach Yidden, Chet Kit Vorecha. In fact, it's such a bad thing to test Hashem that even after Hashem has forgiven us, and even if He's forgiven us in the lines or along the lines of what Moshe Rabbeinu said, can it say Nit Kover Sein Eretz Yisrael? You still cannot conquer Eretz Yisrael. So originally He says Lo Yaminu. The problem is you don't have faith. To which Moshe Rabbeinu says, yeah, if you don't have faith, we don't have a result that's going to create more lack of faith in the world. So the Eibishter says, fine. But Vayinasu, the fact that they tested me, is far worse. How so? In Vos, besteht die Halbkeit von Vayinasu, what makes testing Hashem so bad and so much worse than not believing in Hashem? It's verstandig. It's actually fairly self-understood when you consider it. Pshas lo yamin li bichala isas ashas isi bekirboy. Men glaubt in the bavisen a getliche oises. If somebody is seeing miracles and that doesn't create faith, it's for an answer. There's a way to fix this. We'll show them a bigger, more mind-blowing miracle, which will force them to have to believe in Hashem's abilities. And also bring in the Tzu Yaminu Bi, and that will remind them to believe. If you see the precedent for this, when Hashem sends Moshe to the Yidden originally. So the Eibusha tells Moshe, if they don't listen to your voice after you've shown them the first miraculous sign, the subsequent sign will convince them. A person who has a lack of faith maybe needs a little bit more of a powerful miracle in their lives. But testing Hashem is something very different to having a faith wobble. As the pasuk says, the people who are testing Hashem are currently seeing miracles on a regular basis. They see the miracles, they recognize that it's Hashem doing the miracles, and here's the terrible part of it. While they're watching the miracles, they're testing Hashem. Not just once, 10 times. And it's so stark that they're rejecting Hashem's miracles to the extent that they don't listen to His voice. How's it going to help to show them more miracles? Miracles are not working, not talking to them. They're testing Hashem in spite of miracles. Und der Eufen in Vayinaso sie drückt sich aus Dafke in die drei Sugenisönes, was Rashi brings to illustrate this point of what it is to test Hashem even in the face of a miracle. For that, Rashi brings these three sets or three pairs of times that they tested Hashem because they'll really illustrate the point to us. Bazei is a davar v'hifuchai, because the contradiction, the oxymoron of their experience, that they're seeing the Eibishter's greatness and the Eibishter's hand, and simultaneously testing Hashem, given in themselves in Gufa, you could see that not only do they see a miracle in that arena and they test Hashem in that arena, but these are examples where the space within which they're seeing Hashem's miracle is the space within which they're testing Hashem, which is a mind-blowing thought. Bayom, let's start with the sea. As we've discussed, the second time they tested Hashem with the sea was after the miracle had happened. They had seen the splitting of the sea, they had seen the Gilui Kus at the splitting of the sea, they're on the other side. What kind of a perspective is that to say, just as we, the chosen people, were saved from this miracle that clearly is out of the world, simultaneously the Mitzvim should be also saved. In derselben Zeit, wenn der Eibishter hat für sie gemacht, dem größten Nest von Chris Yamsuf, haben ihnen es Schaß, meiste Guffer, Menasse gewähnt, dem Eibishter geteilt, öfter seinen euch der Mitzvah gerecht wird geworden. In the same time that they're seeing this mega miracle, that's the same time they're testing Hashem and saying, how do we know you didn't save the Egyptians? It's a mind-blowing perspective. Shneim Bamon, maybe not as dramatic, but as clear, is with Amon. Al Teitzu Vayotzu. The Eibishter says he has miraculous food. Don't go get it on Shabbos, so they go look on Shabbos. Al Teisiru, don't keep leftovers. Vayosiru, they keep leftovers. The money is given a nes goloi. The money is a stark miracle. A new reality that had never existed and hasn't existed since. Bread that comes from heaven. While they're eating the mon, they're testing Hashem. The Eibishter hat angesagt, Al Teisiru. The Eibishter says, don't keep any leftovers. Und sie haben geproven, the Eibishter vayosiru. So how do they test Hashem? They keep leftovers. While you're eating miraculous food, you're testing Hashem. The Eibishter hat gesagt, dass wir am Shabbos wetten nicht machen, wenn es von Yudit Samon und der Far Al Teitzu. The Eibishter who's providing the mon tells you it's not going to happen on Shabbos. Ist man heraus und so ausproben und then see the money is gegangen. So what do you have Shabbos morning? People go out and they have a look. Maybe Taka. Maybe the man actually came. Efter ist nicht ausgehalten das, was der Eibishter hat gesagt, dass Shabbos wird nicht machen, dem Nest von Yeridas Samon. Maybe the Eibishter is not going to keep his word to withhold the man on Shabbos. It's mind-blowing. You're eating man, that's how you're surviving, and you're using that to test Hashem. Was derech se beim Slav? Same thing with Slav. Was Yidden haben geteilt, mi achileinu basar. The Yidden say to the Eibishter, who's going to feed us meat? Das heißt, nachdem wie mit der Yom B'Yom ist gegangen, der Mon min Hashamayim. Every single day they're getting mon. Only Shittas Rashi eich Slav. According to Rashi, every day with the mon there was already meat, there was already Slav. Yet they get overwhelmed by this incredible desire. To have more meat. So, okay, you have a desire, Mela. But they ask the question, who could give us meat? As the boss of was a will and Slav Rishon, can the Eibishter nicht geben, suggesting that in addition to the Slav, they already have the Eibishter, from the Eibishter on a daily basis in a miraculous fashion, and they're testing, is it possible for the Eibishter to give more? Whereas all the others that Rashi leaves in the etc., the fact that they're complaining that there's no water, or the water is undrinkable, and chet ha'egel, v'chet ha'meraglim, there you don't see that it's in the same experience, in the same event, that they're both accepting a miracle and testing Hashem. And the Rashi is saying nitmatik beferish, and that's why Rashi doesn't quote them as an example, because they don't illustrate clearly what it means to test Hashem. Now this is a powerful lesson for us. One of those lessons is man muss gedenken, auf wie viel man darf sein Gehet Zoyer und Zoris als die Eises, was der Eibische Weisle Haprat und zum Klall soll ein Peul sein mit seiner ganzen Starkheit. We have to be absolutely vigilant. When the Eibische does miracles or shows us signs, whether it's to individuals or to the broader community, it has to be effective. We have to be conscious of it. So soll ein Peul sein mit seiner ganzen Starkheit und Meise befeuillen in our pnimius. If the Eibische does something for us, it has to affect us in a very personal way and translate it into something that we're going to do better. If you imagine the possibility of the generation of the desert, who were a generation of profound insight and understanding, and yet there was the possibility as noch die Oasis, that in spite of all the miracles, they could still test the Eibishter multiple times. How much more so in our lowly pre-messianic generation. We have to work and work to be absolutely sure that we don't make the same mistake, that we're cognizant of, grateful of, aware of the Eibishter's input in our lives and miracles in our lives, and we don't chas v'shalom test. Und durch dem, was jeder wird sich missbeinen sein in die Oasis, was der Eibishter hat getan mit ihnen als Klall. When a person pays attention to the great wonders that the Eibush has done for the Jewish world, und mit jedem einem als Prat, and for each of us individually, his bonus in an ofen as das nimmt him durch den ganzen and proper attention and contemplation till it totally grabs and absorbs us. In other words, we become absolutely conscious of the Eibush's greatness in our lives. Is das Meichen Eden zu der Knesset Yisrael dem Shech Tzidkenu. That prepares us to be able to go into Eretz Yisrael, the exact opposite of that generation who lost their faith and tested Hashem and therefore could not go into Eretz Yisrael. So if we keep our faith and we strengthen our faith and we're conscious of the Eibishter's miracles in our lives and therefore we don't test him, that prepares us to go into Eretz Yisrael dem Shech Tzidkenu with Mashiach. Begulo amitis hanitzchis, with a true and eternal geula. Which will never be followed by another golus, similar to the prophecy of Micha, that just like when we went out of Mitzrayim, that just as the Eibusher took us out of Mitzrayim with tremendous miracles, very, very soon, immediately now, we should see great miracles of the Geula and go into Eretz Yisrael.